Okay, well, welcome to our webinar, the third of a series uh, from our Venezuela working group at the Jack D. Gordon Institute. Delighted to have all of you here. Um, Today's session is dedicated really to thinking about Venezuela in 2025, and particularly focusing on the events leading up to January the 10th and post January the 10th. So our moderator is Brian Fonseca, the director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute, somebody well known to all of you for issues related to Venezuela. And of course, just in time, Brian wrote a very interesting and provocative article, which was just published last night or early this morning on the topic that we are about to discuss, and really the topic of the three webinars that we've held. I'm sure that at some point during our session we will engage Brian on his hypothesis in this article. But nevertheless, I encourage all of you to go to our webpage and read Brian's article. So Brian, I'll turn it over to you for our seminar, which should run about an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Thanks, Eduardo. I really appreciate the choice terms of provocative. I think that was the spirit of putting that piece together. And it almost sounded like you wanted to have that discussion today, but I'm going to avoid that for now. I think it will be appropriate to bring us together to have a conversation about some of the things I put forward in that piece. And I promise I won't do any peddling of that work throughout the session today. I don't need to. I have three incredibly thoughtful people joining us today, and I'm really excited at the discussion we have lined up. And so let me briefly introduce. I say briefly because it's really hard to introduce some of them because of the incredible backgrounds they have, but I'm going to try to briefly introduce them, and then maybe set the stage a little bit for the spirit of today's discussion, and then I'll start rapid firing questions to our speakers, and we'll drive that for about 45 minutes or so, and then from there we'll see if there's any questions online. So first and foremost, it's an absolute honor to introduce Mark Feierstein. I don't think there are many Latin Americanists that haven't encountered Mark's work at some point throughout their career. Mark's bio goes on and on, but just a few highlights. In his current role as a senior advisor with the Latin American program at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Mark, I think that's the last time I saw you in person, was at USIP recently. Prior to USIP, Feierstein served more than 3 decades at senior levels in public and private sectors. In government, he has served as Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere Affairs and Special Assistant to the President on the National Security Council, Acting Deputy Director, Deputy Administrator, as well as Assistant Administrator for the Latin American and Caribbean at USAID, and Acting Deputy Chief of Mission for the U.S. Mission to the Organization of American States. Outside of government, Mark spent significant time as a principal at a polling firm, as Director of Latin America at the National Democratic Institute, and as a journalist in Mexico and the United States. And so, Mark, thank you so much for being here. Next, I want to welcome Geoff. Geoff is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He has also published some provocative work as of late, so highly recommend you check out that. We're both being provocative together, and so it's exciting to have you with us today, Geoff. Geoff is a leading expert in U.S. policy towards Venezuela, and he's traveled regularly to the country over the last decade. Before joining the Atlantic Council, Geoff directed the Venezuela program at the Washington Office on Latin America, where he led the organization's research on Venezuela and worked to promote lasting political dialogue aimed at restoring human rights, democratic institutions, and rule of law. And in fact, earlier this year, Geoff, Eduardo, and I teamed between FIU and the Atlantic Council to host an event ahead of the July 28 elections to sort of explore the potential scenarios through the elections and sort of post-elections. And I would argue, Geoff, that we weren't incredibly far off from where some of our conclusions were in mid-January. And of course, Gustavo Azocar, it's a pleasure to have you join us today. In fact, Gustavo was on campus, I think, maybe 2 months ago in Miami at an earlier session we had this semester exploring, some of the challenges and repression taking place in Venezuela. Gustavo is a famed journalist, writer, and political consultant. He holds a master's degree in political communications from the George Washington University here in the U.S. And is a doctoral candidate in political science, just like me. And of course, has an incredible career studying and sort of exploring some of the political, social, and security threads in Venezuela. And I'll note that Gustavo is actually joining us today from Venezuela. And so again, grateful to have you join us today, Gustavo. So I think much of the dialogue today is going to be focused on where we're at in the context of the political, social, and economic situation in Venezuela today. And with January 10th rapidly approaching, and sort of again a sort of sparked contest between what's going to happen on January 10th. Is this going to look akin to what happened when Juan Guaido was named interim president, and you had this massive sort of split in the international system? And then a prolonged period of intense conflict in the country, which resulted in what we know now to be sort of violent, repressive, and not sort of moving us in the direction towards the restoration of democracy and human rights in Venezuela, but rather further away from any seeming sense of democratic solvency in Venezuela today. And so I think the spirit of our conversation is to explore some of those. And so with that, Gustavo, I'm going to ask Gustavo my questions in English, and he is going to respond in Spanish. And then the rest of the session will be held in English. But Gustavo, I want to start with you. I want to ask you about the current state of play in Venezuela's political landscape as we approach January 10th. We know what the immediate aftermath of July 28th has been in terms of the repression against opposition and attempting to, again, solidify and centralize authority in the regime. But can you tell me how that landscape is evolving as we get to January 10th, and how have the contested 24 elections shaped the balance of power between Nicolas Maduro and those sort of in the political elite in Caracas, and of course Edmundo Gonzalez, Maria Machado, and sort of the opposition that seemed to be, charging towards a victory in July. Can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Gracias por la oportunidad de participar en este webinar. Comienzo por decir que la situación política en Venezuela está cada vez más complicada, más compleja, en la medida en que se acerca el 10 de enero. Estamos prácticamente a un mes del 10 de enero, y en la medida en que se acerca el 10 de enero, la situación política en Venezuela se torna mucho más complicada para los venezolanos. La incertidumbre que hay en Venezuela en torno a lo que pueda ocurrir el 10 de enero, con un Nicolás Maduro aferrado al poder, sobre todo por el apoyo que le ofrecen los militares, y obviamente con María Corina Machado y Edmundo González reclamando el triunfo que obtuvieron el pasado 28 de julio de 2024 con más de 7 millones de votos. A esto hay que sumar, obviamente, el hecho de lo que va a ocurrir en Estados Unidos el 20 de enero, la toma de posesión del presidente Donald Trump, que le va a agregar de alguna manera, pues, más presión un poco a lo que va a ocurrir en Venezuela. Y todo eso, obviamente, la crisis política que todavía persiste en Venezuela supone que va a mantener o a acrecentar la crisis económica, porque en Venezuela hay una crisis política, pero también hay una severa crisis económica. Entonces, primero, definir lo que va a pasar el 10. Hay varios escenarios de cara al 10 de enero. El escenario número uno es que Maduro se juramente en una Asamblea Nacional que él tiene bajo su control, con un Tribunal Supremo de Justicia que él tiene también bajo su control y con todos los poderes públicos bajo su control. Lo que puede hacer Maduro el 10 de enero seguramente va a ser militarizar toda la ciudad de Caracas y seguramente gran parte del país, militarizarla, colocar militares en muchas partes de Venezuela para evitar movilizaciones ese día, para evitar protestas y para él juramentarse en una suerte de cuarto cerrado en la Asamblea Nacional con el apoyo de los militares. Ese es el escenario número uno. Edmundo González ha dicho que va a venir a Venezuela y que va a juramentarse en Venezuela. Pero evidentemente, primero habría que ver si realmente Edmundo González llega al país y cómo va a llegar. Y segundo, ¿dónde se va a juramentar Edmundo González? Porque Edmundo González tendría que juramentarse en la Asamblea Nacional, de acuerdo con lo que dice la Constitución, una Asamblea Nacional que controla Nicolás Maduro. El elemento militar va a jugar un papel muy importante aquí. El elemento militar, el apoyo de Maduro con los militares de alguna manera va a jugar un papel muy importante porque con la militarización del país, obviamente Maduro puede controlar de alguna manera lo que va a ocurrir el 10 de enero. Independientemente de lo que pase, la historia de Venezuela se parte en dos el 10 de enero y seguramente la crisis política se va a quintuplicar en Venezuela. Se va a quintuplicar, se va a complicar. Y 10 días después, con la toma de posesión del presidente Donald Trump, seguramente las cosas se van a complicar muchísimo más. Porque todo parece indicar que el presidente Trump viene nuevamente con una política fuerte de sanciones para Venezuela. Y lo que uno lee y lo que uno escucha es que Trump pudiera comenzar con un paquete de sanciones que pudieran apuntar a lo que es el sector petrolero en Venezuela, es decir, PDVSA, las negociaciones de PDVSA, la presencia de Chevron en Venezuela y obviamente todo eso, si eso es lo que realmente ocurre, un nuevo paquete de sanciones por parte de la administración Trump a la administración de Maduro, obviamente tendríamos, como alguien lo denominó, la tormenta perfecta. Una crisis política muy grave con Maduro no solamente desconociendo la voluntad popular, sino autojuramentándose a pesar de haber perdido las elecciones, sino con las consecuencias que las decisiones económicas y políticas de Trump pudieran agregarle a todo eso. De tal manera que lo que viene para Venezuela a partir de enero de 2025, con esas dos fechas, 10 de enero y luego 20 de enero, con la toma de posesión de Donald Trump, obviamente coloca unos enormes nubarrones sobre el futuro inmediato de los venezolanos, comenzando precisamente lo que sería el año 2025.
Thank you so much for that, Gustavo. And one of the points that you made that has long been argued is the incredible role that the military institution plays in many ways as the sort of the keeper of change or continuity in Venezuela, and the way that will continue to enable the regime to survive. Mark, I want to come to you and talk a little bit about the role of international actors, particularly the U.S., in influencing the lead up to and sort of through the January 10th space. Obviously, the U.S. had an incredible role that played out in January of 2019. What do you think that role is going to look like as we transition, by the way, from a Biden administration into a Trump administration?
Yeah. So thanks, Brian. First, thank you very much for the invitation. There was a time that invitations to FIU conferences meant a trip to Miami. That's no longer the case, regrettably, but appreciate being here in any case. And I'll try to be as provocative as you and Geoff have been, and I expect will be today. So I think it's helpful to think about the role of the United States just very, very quickly, just go back a couple of years. I mean, once the opposition committed to participate in the elections, the U.S. did everything diplomatically to make that possible. And I think there's an agreement that, the opposition primary that Maria Corina Machado won, last year and really helped forge unity among the opposition. That took place thanks to U.S. diplomacy. There was a real risk it was going to be canceled. I think the fact that Edmundo Gonzalez was on the ballot ultimately was, even though Machado was not allowed to run, was because of U.S. diplomacy and that of regional actors like Brazil. And I think the fact that the opposition was able to mobilize and prove that they won the election, was due in part to key support that they got from international actors. Now, obviously, since July 28th, I think the United States and other countries have hit a wall. There was a hope that countries like Colombia, Brazil, even Mexico, might have some entree with the regime, channels and credibility that the United States doesn't have, and would be able to convince the regime to engage in talks with the opposition about a potential transition. I think they've tried. I think they've made clear their view that Maduro did not in fact win the election. Other countries in the region have been vocal, like Chile and Argentina and Peru. Those countries, of course, don't really have any sway with the regime. But I think everyone, the United States and the entire region, they're really frustrated with the recalcitrance of the regime. And whatever diplomatic isolation there's been, whatever inducements have been offered, have not been sufficient to convince the regime to sit down and engage in talks with the opposition about some sort of a transition. I think ultimately, the regime feels like they can face down, regional countries. They can survive, thanks to support from, outside powers like China, Russia, Cuba, of course, has been important. But I think that, the challenge has been trying to figure out how to change the calculation of the regime. How do you convince Maduro and others in the regime that it's better for them to negotiate, with certain guarantees and concessions and leave power, that would be in their interests, preferable to staying in power and running the risk of having something go awry, not only for the country, but certainly for them as well. Now, in terms of the January 10th date specifically, there's a question for the United States, of course, in terms of recognition of Edmundo Gonzalez. The Biden administration has shifted from merely saying that Edmundo got the most votes to now acknowledging that he is, or recognizing him or designating him as president-elect. I do not anticipate the United States is going to recognize Edmundo as president on January 10th. I think the Biden administration is making a distinction between the political designation of being president-elect versus legal recognition, which introduces all sorts of complications, and that might be left to the incoming administration. And obviously recognizing alternative government, as we saw with the Guaido experience, is quite complicated. It's uncommon. And introduces a whole range of difficult issues. And of course, the Guaido experience, no disrespect to him or those around him, but obviously, didn't work out. It's not necessarily a model to be followed. I think the other thing dynamic we need to look at with regard to January 10th is that there is, and based on the polling I've done in Venezuela recently, there is a surprising sense of optimism in the country and hope, if you will, or faith, that Edmundo Gonzalez is actually going to take office on January 10th. And whether that's by him returning or, through some sort of bold action, but for whatever reason, people have a level of faith that's going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, I think you're going to see a significant increase in migration beginning right afterward. Now, obviously, plenty of people are leaving now because of conditions in the country and Maduro's staying power. But if you reach January 10th and there's no longer that sense of hope, I think you're going to have a big wave of people starting to come in right after that.
Sorry, Mark, can I ask a follow-up question on that? What do you think is
Sure.
driving that hope? Is there a sense of ambiguity in the country right now? Or is it driven by an expectation of outside forces? What's driving that, do you think?
So it's a really interesting question, and we did some message testing, various testing, and more than anything else, it comes down to mano tengo fe. It's just a sense of faith. More so than a confidence in regional actors, international actors. There is increasing interest in the international community doing something dramatic to advance a transition. People are fearful, understandably. They're hesitant to participate in public demonstrations. They're more open to doing things online. And we've seen this play out before. We saw this during some of the Guaido period in 2019, 2020. People were, again, looking for some sort of outside force to solve the problem for them. Now, in fairness, what the opposition might say, what average Venezuelans might say is, look, we've done everything expected of us. Under the most difficult circumstances, we organized, we mobilized, we voted in massive numbers. We won 2-1, against Maduro. We proved it. And now there's this wave of repression, and, Gustavo laid this out, and, people are being jailed and tortured and killed, and there's not much more we can do. So I think it's an understandable sentiment that we'd see this sort of shift toward the outside, to those actors outside Venezuela. But I think what history would tell us is ultimately, and I'm sure we'll get into this, there's only so much the United States and other countries can do, that there needs to be a mix of domestic and international pressure, and that domestic piece is really vital.
Yeah, and sorry, Geoff, I promise I just want one more follow-up for Mark on this, because I find it's really fascinating, sort of the sentiment piece. And so when you conducted those surveys and you sort of tested messaging, did the U.S. election have anything to do with that? Did you get a sense of maybe there's not a clear understanding of sort of how transition occurs in the United States or the timeline? Did sort of a change in administration in the United States provoke any of that thinking you sense?
Good question. I don't sense that. And to be honest, a lot of the ideas that are being bandied about as, potential actions for the incoming administration are not popular in Venezuela.
Yeah.
I mean, there is support for targeted sanctions, individual sanctions, which of course the Biden administration has used extensively. There is much less support for economic sanctions, and there's a sense that that hurts people more generally, and that's been true for some time. I think what we did see during the Trump years, when the administration would talk about all options being on the table, implying the possibility of some sort of invasion of sorts. Of course, that was never the case, but it was being said. That did raise expectations, I think, for opposition leaders at the time, for average Venezuelans. And I think, some of that is returning as well. And, I think, even Venezuelans have this idea that you can have some sort of clean operation in which some outside force is going to come in and sweep away the problem. But we all know from history it doesn't work that way.
That's right. And I can't tell you how many times colleagues of mine here in Miami, whether it's West Venezuela or Little Caracas here in Doral, will send me a text and say, "When are we sending the Marines?" And I'm not sure the U.S. is sending the Marines. I mean, it's a tough. And going back to your piece on, and I want to point out, Dr. Eduardo Gamata's work. He conducted a series of surveys on how the Venezuelan diaspora community sees American foreign policy in Venezuela. And interestingly enough, there seemed to be a consensus, or at least even if it's a slight majority, that had were more concerned about the humanitarian crisis than than the sort of political conditions, right? It was more about sanctions are hurting people. How do we get back to sort of thinking about these broad sanctions as doing more damage than good, and then reflecting on the targeted sanctions? This is a great point. I appreciate. Geoff, okay, here's the big question. What's the role of multilateral organizations like the OAS, the EU, in the current crisis? And sort of I'll see this, and I remember having a conversation with one of our colleagues, Frank Mora, who's currently U.S. ambassador to the OAS. Used to often argue that things like the Democratic Charter were put in place to deal with autocracies, not so much democracies co-opted by authoritarians. At what point does sort of the OAS start to have the kind of teeth to shape behavior in places like Venezuela, where there may be more clarity that it's not an autocracy that's co-opted to democracy? It may be more akin to a dictatorship that's done away with elections altogether.
Yeah, no, and just to say thanks again for the invitation. I also was expecting a trip to sunny Miami, but I guess that'll have to wait till 2025. And I'm not sure how provocative I will or won't be. But please direct any complaints to Mark Feierstein. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the international organization piece, it's really a challenge because we've been there before. In 2017 through 2019, or actually through 2018, there really was a push at the OAS in particular to get countries across the region to really leverage the Inter-American Charter and the Democracy Clause in particular to try to break something loose in Venezuela, to try to advance a democratic solution. And in response to that, the Venezuelans said, basically, you can't fire me, I quit. They pulled out of the OAS. There's sort of this awkward limbo where the former representative of the former interim government has retired from his position as the Venezuelan ambassador to the OAS, and the rest of the OAS member states are essentially just looking the other way and just not addressing the legal question of whether or not Venezuela is or isn't a member of the OAS. For the U.S. government, at least when the interim government was still around, the argument was that when the interim government took over, they rescinded the decision to withdraw from the body. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a struggle. I don't really view the OAS as being the best forum for addressing the Venezuela crisis. That's not to say that it's completely irrelevant. Today's special session, looking at the situation faced by members of Maria Corina Machado's team, they're holed up in the Argentine residence, is really important in highlighting the facts on the ground and raising awareness and providing a space for countries to denounce human rights violations and the deepening authoritarianism in the country. But I don't think the solution is going to come from the OAS because, again, the de facto government in Venezuela doesn't recognize it. I think the UN has more that it can do. I think the Secretary General's decision to publish the report or the findings of the report on the stolen July 28th presidential election was really significant. And I think there may be more of an appetite in the wake of the election for the U.S. or for the UN to take a more active role. There was a lot of resistance on the Security Council the last time that the U.S. tried to elevate Venezuela in the UN, and I anticipate that will continue to be a factor this time around. But I think at this point the UN of any other multilateral body is the best positioned. But I think the reality is that probably the best chance for any kind of multilateral coordination to respond to the Venezuela crisis is for ad hoc coordination. And we saw this before. We saw the creation of the Lima Group in 2017, which at least for a while was really active and engaged in responding to developments on the ground. We saw the EU create the International Contact Group, which tried to sort of preserve space for credible negotiations. So, I think there's room for more of those sort of ad hoc initiatives in the international community. And I think there's more room for action from the UN, but the OAS in particular, I think, unfortunately, is not going to be the venue to resolve the Venezuela crisis.
Thanks, Geoff. Gustavo, I want to come back to you to talk a little bit more about the again, a lot of eyes are focused on January 10th and sort of what happens then. And I know you touched on it a little bit in your first your first intervention. But can you talk a little bit about what are the likely scenarios that are, so what are the likely scenarios if Maduro refuses to cede power, which is, again, a most likely outcome? What do you expect to be sort of best case scenario, worst case scenario? If you can talk a little bit about that in terms of expectation on January 10th and sort of the immediate aftermath of January 10th.
Estás en mute, Gustavo.
Ahora sí. Ok, gracias, Eduardo. Como lo dije en la primera parte de mi intervención, yo hablé de un primer escenario que pareciera ser el más probable. Es decir, como Maduro tiene bajo sus manos el control de todo el poder público y de los diferentes poderes que hay en Venezuela, controla el Tribunal Supremo de Justicia, controla la Fuerza Armada, controla la Policía Nacional, controla el ejército, tiene además relaciones muy peligrosas con grupos armados, con bandas criminales, relaciones peligrosas con grupos guerrilleros colombianos como el Ejército de Liberación Nacional, que está presente prácticamente en más de la mitad del territorio venezolano. Tiene además, obviamente, el apoyo de Cuba, de Rusia, de Irán, de China. De hecho, hay cubanos, rusos, chinos e iraníes en Venezuela ofreciendo apoyo militar y policial a Maduro. Entonces, todo eso conlleva a que el primer escenario, que es Maduro juramentándose a la fuerza, violando la Constitución el 10 de enero, pareciera ser que es lo que pudiera ocurrir. Pero, obviamente, hay otros escenarios. Y es que a lo interno del gobierno de Maduro hay una lucha por el poder muy importante entre algunos actores, como por ejemplo Diosdado Cabello, que actualmente tiene mucho poder después del 28 de julio de 2024. El poder de Cabello aumentó o se incrementó exponencialmente. Cabello es en este momento el hombre que controla la policía científica, la Policía Nacional, una parte importante de la Fuerza Armada, y eso le permite de alguna manera tener control de lo que son los organismos de seguridad del Estado, e incluso tiene control de un sector importante de la Fuerza Armada. Entonces hay una disputa allí entre Cabello y Maduro que pudiera en algún momento influir o generar otro escenario en el caso de que de repente Maduro tuviera algún tipo de dificultad para asumir el poder el 10 de enero. Seguramente la presencia de Cabello allí va a servir como una suerte de bisagra o de torniquete para obligar a que ellos mantengan ahí el control. Lo de Edmundo se apoya lógicamente en el hecho cierto de que Edmundo obtuvo 7 millones de votos contra 3 millones de Nicolás Maduro, pero no es menos cierto que Edmundo no tiene poder real dentro de Venezuela, salvo un enorme apoyo popular que tiene él y que tiene también María Corina Machado. Y obviamente Edmundo tiene el apoyo de Estados Unidos, el apoyo de Italia, el apoyo de Argentina, el apoyo de Ecuador, que son los países o los gobiernos que se han manifestado en apoyo a Edmundo González y que lo han reconocido como presidente electo. Pero, por ejemplo, no ha pasado con Colombia, que es nuestro principal vecino, el que tenemos acá al lado. El gobierno de Petro todavía no termina de reconocer a Edmundo González. Tampoco ha reconocido a Maduro, pero tampoco reconoce a Edmundo González. Tenemos a Brasil, que es un actor político muy importante en toda Sudamérica, que tampoco ha reconocido a Maduro, pero que igualmente no termina de reconocer a Edmundo González. Es decir, nuestros principales aliados y vecinos como Colombia y Brasil no tienen una posición o una postura definida con relación a González o a Maduro, y eso obviamente influye de alguna manera en el resto de lo que tiene que ver con América Latina. Todo esto enmarcado en un hecho económico importante, en una crisis económica importante, que es el hecho de que Venezuela está dependiendo en este momento de Chevron para sostener su alicaída economía. Es decir, los pocos dólares que ingresan a Venezuela en este momento ingresan porque Chevron está aquí. Ingresan por esa licencia 41 que vence, por cierto, en abril de 2025. Entonces, al deadline que tenemos en enero 10 y luego enero 20, súmenle una fecha 25 o abril 2025, que es la fecha en la cual se vence la licencia 41 que el gobierno de Estados Unidos le otorgó a Chevron. La pregunta es, ¿qué va a hacer Trump con esa licencia que vence en abril? Obviamente, la decisión que Trump va a tomar va a depender de los acontecimientos que se produzcan el 10 de enero, de lo que pase en enero, de lo que pase en febrero y de lo que pase en el mes de marzo. Sanciones. Las sanciones que el gobierno de Estados Unidos ha aplicado contra el sector petrolero venezolano, está demostrado que esas sanciones, cuando fueron aplicadas en el año 2019, 2020, 21, 22, 23, desafortunadamente lo que hicieron fue no solamente golpear a la muy alicaída venezolana y golpear a sectores importantes de Venezuela, sino que lanzaron a Maduro a los brazos de Rusia, de China y de Irán. Es decir, cada vez que han venido paquetes de sanciones contra la industria petrolera venezolana o contra el oro venezolano, por solo citar dos elementos, Maduro se agarra más de los rusos, se agarra más de los chinos, porque esos son sus aliados para poder enfrentar al gobierno de Estados Unidos. Entonces, las sanciones, si bien es cierto que pudieran ser un mecanismo de presión importante para el gobierno de Maduro, no es menos cierto que Maduro ha aprendido a sortear las sanciones con la ayuda de Irán, con la ayuda de Rusia y de otros países que se las ingenian para permitir que Maduro siga negociando petróleo y sus derivados, vendiéndolos a precios, por supuesto, muy por debajo del mercado, contrabandeando oro, contrabandeando muchas de las riquezas minerales que tiene Venezuela para poder sobrevivir. Y al final, el grueso de las sanciones golpean la economía con las consecuencias que eso trae para Venezuela en materia de desempleo, de migración, el aumento de la migración, el aumento de la salida de los venezolanos. Al día de hoy hay una creciente salida de venezolanos por la frontera con Colombia, venezolanos que quieren llegar a Estados Unidos antes del 20 de enero, cuando la toma de posesión de Donald Trump, pero venezolanos que también quieren llegar a Estados Unidos antes del 10 de enero, que es la fecha que en este momento se constituye en el principal dolor de cabeza para los venezolanos. Entonces, conclusión, los escenarios, cualquiera sea el escenario por el que te inclines, Maduro juramentándose, Edmundo González llegando a Venezuela con el apoyo de Estados Unidos, de Canadá, de Francia, de Italia y de otros países, la confrontación política que eso puede generar en Venezuela, Cabello allí con poder de fuego, con poder policial, con poder militar para contrarrestar cualquier movimiento popular que pudiera presentarse. Cualquiera de los escenarios, repito, que se presentan en Venezuela a partir del 10 de enero son catastróficos todos. Todos son catastróficos por donde se le mire. Todo apunta a que se nos viene encima una situación bien complicada, va a tener un papel muy, muy importante.
Thank you, Gustavo. And I agree, it's incredibly complex, and it doesn't seem like there are any scenarios that that seem to be without incredible, sort of catastrophic, as you frame, catastrophic outcomes. Geoff, I want to come to you and sort of kind of ask you to weigh in on what the sort of scenarios that Gustavo put out there. What do you think are sort of the worst case, best case scenarios? Is there a real risk? And I think the answer is yes, but I want to hear precise. A real risk of increased violence or repression as the sort of 10th approaches as we move through the 10th. And in that context, what can civil society organizations or international organizations do to alleviate those risks as we get closer?
Yeah, sure. So, I think, the answer is obviously yes. There is a clear risk of violence and repression in the lead up to, but especially on January 10th. I think obviously for Maduro, this is existential. He wants to show that he's absolutely in control. And that's one of the reasons why they've been so relentless in going after opposition activists, including one recent arrest just yesterday. The truth is that Maduro has every incentive to show that he will take power on January 10th and that he will continue to rule the country for the next 6 years. I think, though, the opposition has had now 6 months to plan, and I think they've been keeping their powder dry. Part of that, I think, was a smart decision after seeing the level of repression in reaction to those 3 days of protests after the July 28th election. I think the opposition also learned from the experience of the interim government days, where they saw that sort of just continuous calls to the streets without any sort of clear theory of change ultimately deflated their popularity. And so I think the opposition's learned some interesting lessons from that experience, including the fact that they're just 2 days ago, the opposition coalition, the Plataforma Unitaria, issued a statement saying that Edmundo González would not be taking the oath of office in exile, meaning they're not going to pursue the creation of a presidency in exile, similar to the Guaido experiment. I think the push will be for González to take the oath in Venezuela. And if that's not possible, obviously the opposition is going to do everything they can to raise the cost on Maduro for assuming another illegitimate mandate, and to highlight the urgency of addressing the Venezuela crisis to the international community, and particularly for the incoming administration. As for how you contain that, I think obviously the message needs to be clear to Maduro that these actions will have consequences. I would like, and maybe this is just a pipe dream, but I would love to see greater coordination between the outgoing administration and the incoming administration on Venezuela. At least just clear messaging. The truth is that January 10th through January 20th, Venezuela is going to be in the headlines, and it's in everybody's interest to at least send the message that repressing protests, that detaining opposition activists will come with a cost. And so, I'm not sure how likely that is given the political environment in our own country, but one can dream of some at least minimal level of coordination. Again, with the message being that going after the opposition, going after protesters is not the way for Maduro to ultimately get the legitimacy and access to resources that so far seems to have motivated his participation in previous rounds of negotiations.
Thanks, Geoff. So I'm going to ask just a few more questions, and then I see we're already starting to get messages or questions in the chat. So I'm going to encourage our participants that if they have something they want to ask of our speakers, please throw it in the chat and I'll weave it in here shortly. Mark, I want to come to you and ask you an incredibly difficult question, and it has to do with U.S. foreign policy. How do we get it right? Sort of Geoff kind of hinted at a pipe dream of sort of seamless transition administration where there is a strategy that that administrations sort of maintain continuity over time to sort of deploy, right? And so I want to get your perspective on how Washington should balance the use of sanctions, diplomacy, and regional allies to to shape and influence the landscape in Venezuela today. And then maybe sort of as a second part to that, which will increase the complexity, there are calls for return to maximum pressure, which is something that a potential incoming Secretary of State Rubio would likely pursue, vice a Trump administration that knows that maximum pressure failed the first go around and may have to embrace engagement very differently if it wants to pursue some of its key initiatives like immigration policy and energy policy. So how does that all get reconciled in your view? What should we be doing?
Yeah. Well, if we knew how to do all that, we'd be sitting here celebrating the triumph of Edmundo González and talking about what can be done to support the incoming administration and counting down the days until he takes office. But that's not happening. Look, I think anyone who's been a policymaker, a current or former policymaker, I think we all need to talk about Venezuela with a dose of humility. U.S. government has been dealing with the Chavista movement now for over a quarter century. And U.S. presidents have come and gone. And Chavez lasted until his death, and Maduro has been there, and there's no sign that he's leaving anytime soon. Just looking at the two most recent administrations, obviously the maximum pressure policy failed, as you noted. It left Venezuela poorer, the opposition weaker, Maduro further ensconced in power, contributed to more migration. Not saying it was the cause of those things. Obviously, it's misrule and repression within Venezuela that is sort of the principal cause of the political crisis and the economic conditions, but I think maximum pressure contributed to the worsening of it. And I talked a bit about the Biden approach, which I think until July 28th, looked quite promising, but obviously it's fallen short. It's not ended not ended the dictatorship. I think there is a consensus around the use of targeted sanctions. I think both parties agree on their value. They don't cause collateral damage. And we talked about before, they also have the support of Venezuelans within, inside the country. There are questions about other sanctions, and Gustavo went into this a bit, and the concern that they, hurt Venezuelans, they reduce the U.S. presence. As Gustavo noted, they create more space for actors like Russia and China and Iran. They can, reduce transparency. But I think we need to be thinking more beyond just the sanctions and thinking about sort of the balance that the mix of sanctions and inducements. Because if we accept that, pressure alone is not going to be sufficient, there needs to be, some sort of appeal for the regime to be able to let go of power. The U.S. has leverage. There's a bounty on Maduro, which bothers him to a great extent. It even limits his ability to travel within the country. That is leverage the United States has, and they can offer to lift that in return for concessions from Maduro. There is the indictment of Maduro and other officials. Again, there is some leverage here. Indictments are harder to lift than bounties, but that still could be done and is part of a grand bargain. I think those things have been put on the table, frankly, but they have not been enough, obviously. So I don't think there's sort of a magical mix of sanctions and diplomacy. And if there is, we can't be sure what it is. I mean, in terms of your question about this alternative for the incoming administration, because obviously there is some expectation that with Marco Rubio about to become Secretary of State and Representative Waltz going to the NSC, that there will be a return to some form of maximum pressure. But we know that Donald Trump himself obviously doesn't care about democracy in Venezuela, and as a result, there's been discussion about a oil for migration deal. The problem with that is that there's only so many deportees a country can take. And just because, even if you were to work out an arrangement with Maduro in which Venezuela accepts, deportees, people are going to continue to leave. As long as he's there, people are going to continue to leave. And the only way really to solve all these interests the United States has, access to oil, curbing illegal migration, reducing Venezuela as a hub of criminality, drug trafficking and illegal mining and such. The only way to do that is through a democratic transition. So I think it would be dangerous for the United States and a setback for Venezuela and for countries in the region if we were to put aside the objective of democracy and think that we can deal with all these other problems without getting at the root cause, which ultimately is dictatorship in Venezuela.
Thanks, Mark. Gustavo, one last question for you about, given your place on the ground in Venezuela, what are some of the expectations? It goes back to something that Mark referenced very early on. What are the expectations of the international community in terms of its ability to shape outcomes in Venezuela today? What is the sentiment on the ground in terms of what those outside forces are capable of doing? You're muted again, Gustavo.
Thank you. Excuse me. La mayoría de los venezolanos entiende que la solución a la crisis política venezolana pasa no solamente por lo interno, sino también por lo externo. Es decir, suena un poco crudo decirlo, ¿verdad? Pero no es fácil para los propios venezolanos resolver la crisis política que tenemos en este momento. Requerimos de apoyo de la comunidad internacional. Es inevitable tener apoyo de la comunidad internacional porque no estamos peleando solamente contra Maduro. Esta es una crisis, es una pelea que está enmarcada dentro de la geopolítica internacional. Es decir, Maduro no estaría allí si no tuviera el apoyo como lo ha tenido de China, Rusia, Irán, que son de alguna manera tres potencias importantes que están detrás de Maduro y que tienen grandes intereses acá en Venezuela. La presencia de Irán, sobre todo, la manera como Irán se ha metido y se ha involucrado cada día más en los asuntos internos de Venezuela, la presencia de Irán ya no solamente en lo militar, o sea, ya no es solamente Irán apertrechando al régimen de Maduro con armas, con drones, con asesoría técnica, con asesoría militar, etcétera, etcétera, sino que los iraníes se están metiendo incluso en elementos como, por ejemplo, el oro, el petróleo, tienen control de algunas refinerías en Venezuela, como la refinería del Palito en el estado Carabobo, como el complejo de refinación Paraguaná, que es uno de los complejos de refinación más grandes del mundo, que está en el estado Falcón, Amuay, Cardón, etcétera. Se metieron también en la refinería en Puerto La Cruz, al oriente del país. Es decir, los iraníes se han metido de alguna manera dentro de la industria petrolera y tienen una presencia importante, sobre todo en lo que son las refinerías de petróleo de Venezuela. Se han metido en otros sectores de la economía. Han llegado empresarios iraníes que se han metido a hacer inversiones con supermercados, con abastos. Acaban de firmar un convenio con Maduro para la creación de una supuesta fábrica de fibra óptica en el estado de La Guaira, que está ubicado a escasos 10 kilómetros del principal aeropuerto del país, que es el aeropuerto de Maiquetía. Es decir, no es casual que Irán quiera supuestamente montar una planta de fibra óptica a 10 kilómetros del aeropuerto de Maiquetía, que es la terminal aérea más importante de Venezuela. Entonces, la presencia de Irán es importante y junto con Irán, obviamente, el grupo terrorista apoyado por Irán, que es Hezbollah, que tiene una presencia importante en Venezuela, en algunos sectores de Venezuela, Margarita, Puerto Cabello, Puerto Ordaz, ¿verdad? Entonces, es decir, Irán ejerce hoy por hoy una influencia importante sobre el gobierno de Maduro en lo tecnológico, en lo militar e incluso en lo económico. Obviamente la presencia de Rusia, la presencia de China, la presencia de un ejército de cubanos que está regado por toda Venezuela, disfrazados como entrenadores deportivos, como asesores agrícolas, pero que en realidad son mercenarios cubanos que están para proteger a Maduro. Y luego, la presencia muy grave, por cierto, en los 2.219 kilómetros de frontera que tenemos con Colombia, en toda la línea fronteriza con Colombia, 2.219 kilómetros, Zulia, Táchira, Apure, Amazonas, está la presencia de la guerrilla colombiana del ELN, a la cual Maduro le ha dado prácticamente el control de toda la frontera entre Venezuela y Colombia. Entonces, todo eso complica, entre otras cosas, y aprovecho para responder una pregunta que hacían por el chat, el tema de la transición. ¿Cómo se da una transición en Venezuela? ¿Cómo lograr una transición en Venezuela? ¿Cómo lograr una transición en un país donde Irán, Rusia, China, Cuba tienen un papel importante en la toma de decisiones? Yo no creo que Rusia, China, Irán y Cuba estén interesados en que Maduro apruebe o firme una transición del poder con el Mundo González o con quien sea. Ese es un elemento que necesariamente tenemos que tomar en cuenta. Y alguien preguntaba si en Venezuela podíamos ver un escenario parecido a lo que acaba de ocurrir en Siria. Y aprovecho también para responderlo. Es complicado porque en Siria había un grupo rebelde enfrentando a Bashar al-Assad durante muchos años y de alguna manera la huida de Bashar al-Assad se produjo no solamente por la pérdida de apoyo por parte de Rusia y de otros de sus aliados, sino evidentemente por la presión que ese grupo armado de rebeldes que estuvo ejerciendo sobre las fuerzas militares que estaban al servicio de Bashar al-Assad. Ese no es el escenario en Venezuela. Los opositores en Venezuela, los que nos oponemos a Maduro en Venezuela, no tenemos un grupo rebelde armado para enfrentar a Maduro. Nosotros no tenemos armas, no tenemos tanques, no tenemos granadas, no tenemos ni siquiera una pistolita de agua para enfrentarnos a Maduro. Entonces, obviamente que el escenario es un poco complicado. ¿Qué tiene Edmundo González y qué tiene María Corina Machado? Tienen un respaldo popular enorme en la calle. Las encuestas dicen que Edmundo González y María Corina tienen cerca del 75-80% de apoyo de la población, pero de la población civil, que somos ciudadanos comunes y corrientes, que siempre apostamos a las salidas democráticas, a las salidas constitucionales, que fuimos a votar creyendo que al votar podíamos producir el cambio que Venezuela estaba necesitando. Entonces, no luce tan fácil. Tiene que haber, obviamente, una presión de la comunidad internacional, de la comunidad internacional, y obviamente lo ideal es que esa presión debería producirse desde los países que están más cercanos a Venezuela. Si nosotros no sumamos a Colombia, si no sumamos a Brasil en esta lucha por la recuperación de la democracia venezolana, lástima que en Brasil al presidente Lula da Silva acabo de enterarme que lo operaron de una hemorragia cerebral, ojalá se recupere, pero si no hay la participación de Brasil en esta lucha y si no hay una participación de Colombia, que son nuestros vecinos más cercanos allí para tratar de convencer a Maduro de una salida negociada, apoyada por supuesto por Estados Unidos y por el resto de la comunidad internacional, va a ser muy difícil. Entonces, sí, la comunidad internacional tiene un papel enorme aquí, enorme. Y toda la comunidad internacional tiene que actuar y ojalá lo hagamos pronto para ver si es posible llegar al 10 de enero a una negociación que le permita a Maduro poder entregar el poder y que permita obviamente que Edmundo González asuma el poder con las dificultades que eso supone, porque si Edmundo González termina asumiendo la presidencia, va a encontrarse con una Asamblea Nacional en contra, con un Tribunal Supremo de Justicia en contra, con una Fuerza Armada Nacional Bolivariana en contra, con 20 gobernadores de estado en contra y con 200 alcaldes en contra. De modo que no la va a tener tan fácil tampoco Edmundo González para mantener la gobernabilidad si logra finalmente juramentarse el 10 de enero de 2025.
You know, Gustavo gives answers that are so comprehensive. I say he gets all the questions. I think Geoff and I are just gonna sit here and listen and learn. How about that?
I think Gustavo actually leaned forward and answered almost all of the questions we had in the chat. No, Gustavo, I appreciate that thoughtfulness. In fact, you did touch on a couple of the questions, particularly around, for example, Iran and sort of some of the American rivals that are operating in Venezuela, and of course, sort of juxtaposing the situation with Syria. But I'd like to open that up to Mark and Geoff as well, and get your perspectives. And I'll read those two questions, and then there's a few others. And so one was really sort of focused on kind of from our position of status quo right now, where Russia and Iran, and you could say China, of course, and Cuba still hold sway in sort of domestic, influence in Venezuela. How much can these countries support Maduro given the obvious loss of strength, especially in places where Syria just fell? So as a contrast, is there a shakeup occurring in sort of that community of countries in the international system? Geoff or Mark, whichever one wants to take it on, and of course Gustavo.
Yeah, sure. So I think Gustavo's right that I think actors like China, Iran, and Russia have been absolutely crucial to the Maduro regime's survival. I think sometimes it gets a little overplayed. However, the reality is that I don't necessarily think that even if, let's say, the next administration makes some kind of grand bargain with Putin, you take part of the Donbass and you give us Venezuela. I don't actually think. I think the influence of the Russians over Venezuela oftentimes gets overstated. I don't actually believe that, for instance, the Venezuelans have the capability to just deliver, or the Russians have the capability to just deliver Venezuela on a silver platter. That said, they certainly love to be a nuisance to U.S. interests, and they've shown it through servicing the Sukhois, providing intelligence, oil and gas deals, and of course, the Chinese continue to be a major source or a major destination of Venezuelan oil. I think the question that U.S. policymakers are going to have to ask themselves is whether or not, and I think Brian, you touched on this in the paper that we're all talking about. The question that U.S. policymakers are going to have to ask themselves is it in our interest to rescind all the licenses and just sit back with our arms crossed and hope that the regime falls under its own weight, and watch as Venezuela drifts further into the arms of bad actors like Russia, China, Iran, etc., knowing that they've done this before in 2020, after the shockwaves from the 2019 oil sanctions had been felt and the secondary sanctions were slapped on. We saw a learning curve. The regime learned to live with the sanctions and divert oil through shady intermediaries to the Asian market. And up until the recent shifts in licensing policy under the Biden administration, that remained the case, that that Venezuela was exporting most of its oil to the Asian market and importing diluents from Iran. That changed when the license policy changed. And so, I think, again, the question that the U.S. has to ask itself is whether we really think that piling on all the sanctions will guarantee a democratic transition, knowing that it potentially comes with a trade-off for our larger geopolitical interests in the hemisphere.
Thanks, Geoff. Mark, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I agree with Geoff. I think the domino theory has limited application here. I think, Venezuela is relatively low cost for Russia in terms of the kinds of engagement that they have. I think I'm sure the Syria example really holds. And look, we all remember that when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was supposed to be the end of Cuba. I mean, I thought there are, as Geoff noted, there are internal dynamics that are sustaining the regime. I'm not suggesting that the role of China and others is not important, and obviously it's enabled the regime to weather sanctions and other forms of pressure. But I think it's I think at times we exaggerate the role that international factors are having and don't give enough weight to what's going on inside, no matter what's happening on the outside.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, there's sort of almost two elements to this. The first element is how much do international actors prop up the regime, which I think gets overplayed. It serves more as a pressure release valve for the regime to operate in the international system, whereas the domestic politics and sort of the political elite and sort of just the role that the security forces play in propping up the survival of the regime play a far greater role than international actors in terms of the domestic, sort of cohesion of the political elite and sort of the resilience of Maduro to sort of weather these efforts by opposition international actors to displace them. So I think you're absolutely right. But you got to separate those things, and I think that's really important. And so the next question comes from an FIU student who lived in Venezuela for 16 years. It appears this student is back in Venezuela for the holidays. So they were asking as an anonymous attendee, rightfully so. And I think we've touched on the answer already, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least give credence to the question, see if there are any remaining thoughts on it. But the question is, seeing, of course, the elections gave no fruit, the regime has solidified their grasp on the military leaders, and the U.S. seems to have no interest in regime change, which I'm not sure that's necessarily accurate. But is there really any hope for transition of power? And if so, what would the path to restoring democracy be in Venezuela? Let me toss that. I think we've touched around it over the last hour, but let me throw that out there.
Yeah, maybe I'm happy to start, unless Gustavo wants to go or Geoff.
Go.
No.
Go.
Okay, sure. So, look, I think what at least gives me a sense of hope is the leadership that remains in Venezuela, starting with Maria Corina and the bravery of the Venezuelan people. I know that things are exceedingly difficult in Venezuela now, and just speaking to the student, I hope that your family is doing okay. I hope you're doing okay, and I know it's a very, very, very challenging. I hope you have a good holiday. But I think we haven't talked enough, frankly, about Maria Corina and what she's achieved. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. You know, she's the dominant political figure in the country now, the leading opposition figure, the only person in the country that has broad-based support. I shouldn't say the only one. I mean, she's been able to transfer that to Edmundo Gonzalez, but it really is a reflection of Maria Corina. I think it's a combination of her charisma, her bravery, her commitment to some basic democratic ideals, and there's almost a religious fervor around her. I mean, it's really extraordinary if you watch some of the videos. Now, that said, things are that, you know, so difficult that she's currently in hiding. I mean, and she can't even get out. So I do think it's important, you know, yes, Washington will go through all the debates about oil licenses and sanctions and this and that. But I think arguably the most important thing that foreign actors can do is to provide moral and tangible support to the opposition. And there are various things. I mean, obviously diplomatic efforts to release prisoners, to protect Maria Corina and other opposition figures, to help promote unity, but also tangible support to independent journalists, to, you know, so they have the ability to report and to distribute their work. The sharing of organizational techniques from democratic activists in other countries, you know, that have operated in similarly difficult circumstances, you know, creative techniques that go beyond, you know, mass demonstrations, which makes people nervous and haven't been all that effective. I think there's that sort of nitty gritty work of organization and mobilization, but again, which again is really, really hard in this moment. But I think it can be, you know, I think we need to be responsive to the extent possible to, you know, people like Maria Corina, other political leaders, the civic groups, in helping them take advantage with whatever space exists for political activity. You know, up until just a few months ago, Leopoldo Lopez, the, you know, leading opposition figure outside the country, used to say that, you know, in Venezuela, politics is still possible. It's not Nicaragua, it's not Cuba. That space is closing. It's not clear if that's going to be true much longer, but it is true for now, I think. And the question is what can be done and how we can help.
Thanks, Mark. Gustavo, I felt like you wanted to jump in on this question. Did you have any additional thoughts?
Yes. Todo parte de lo que realmente quiera la administración Trump en este segundo mandato de Trump. Yo particularmente creo que Trump debe haber aprendido lo que pasó entre 2016 y 2020. La estrategia que Trump puso en práctica en Venezuela entre 2016 y 2020 está visto que no produjo resultados. Por tanto, si el presidente Trump decide repetir la misma receta que aplicó entre 2016 y 2020, está visto que así como esa receta no funcionó entre 2016 y 2020, probablemente tampoco va a funcionar entre 2025 y 2029. Entonces, eso me hace pensar que la administración Trump tiene que venir con algo más, con algo distinto a lo que aplicaron en esos primeros 4 años. Trump, entre 2016 y 2020, se cansó de decir que todas las opciones estaban sobre la mesa, incluyendo la opción militar, y al final Trump se fue y Maduro siguió allí, y sigue allí. Entonces, uno apuesta a que lo ideal, el terreno ideal sería obviamente el terreno de una negociación, cómo negociar con Maduro. Pero ¿qué tiene en este momento la administración Trump para negociar con Maduro? ¿Qué tiene en la mano para negociar con Maduro y para obligarlo a sentarse en una mesa de negociación y que obviamente cumpla con lo que se acuerde en esa mesa? Porque es el otro elemento. Maduro se ha sentado en 100 mesas de negociación y nunca ha cumplido absolutamente nada de lo que se acuerda en la mesa de negociación. Entonces, la gran pregunta es, ¿qué tiene en sus manos el gobierno de Estados Unidos, el gobierno de Donald Trump, para obligar a Nicolás Maduro a negociar una transición, a negociar la entrega del poder y a permitir que Edmundo González pueda asumir la presidencia de la República? ¿Cuáles son las armas de negociación que pudiera tener eventualmente en la mano el presidente Trump? Del lado de Maduro, muchas veces Maduro es predecible. Uno pudiera predecir lo que va a hacer Maduro en los primeros meses de 2025. ¿Qué va a hacer Maduro comenzando 2025? Lo primero que va a hacer, obviamente, es juramentarse a trocha y mocha, como decimos en Venezuela. Perdónenme el coloquialismo. A trocha y mocha. Es decir, se va a juramentar, se va a encerrar en la Asamblea Nacional, militariza toda la Asamblea Nacional y seguramente dice: aquí estoy yo. Y acto seguido, lo que seguramente va a hacer Maduro es ordenarle al Consejo Nacional Electoral la convocatoria de nuevas elecciones para gobernadores, alcaldes, diputados regionales, ¿verdad?, que se harían probablemente en el primer semestre del año 2025, con lo cual mete otra vez a Venezuela en el tema electoral, distrae al país en una elección que poco importa, pero bueno, son 25 gobernaciones, son 335 alcaldías, y eso vuelve a meter a Venezuela en el tema electoral. Y seguramente divide, fractura una vez más a la ya dividida y fracturada oposición. ¿Por qué? Porque un sector de la oposición va a querer participar en esas elecciones regionales. El sector de la oposición tiene 120 alcaldes, tiene 4 gobernadores, tiene un centenar de diputados en los consejos legislativos, y seguramente esos señores van a querer reelegirse y volver a participar, no van a retirarse de sus puestos. Entonces vamos a tener a una oposición liderada por María Corina Machado y Edmundo González llamando a no votar en esos comicios regionales, y a otra oposición que va a decir: sí, hay que participar para no perder los espacios. Y allí se diluye. Maduro es experto ganando tiempo. Es experto ganando tiempo y es experto dividiendo a la oposición y es experto en lo que yo llamo armas de distracción masiva, o sea, distraer a la gente, poner a la gente a hacer otra cosa mientras él se queda y se amarra y se aferra al poder. Entonces, frente a eso, el gobierno de Estados Unidos tiene que estar obviamente preparado, la oposición tiene que estar preparada, porque Maduro ya tiene su plan de acción para 2025, lo tiene perfectamente claro. Y terminando 2025 convocará elecciones para la Asamblea Nacional. Y cuidado si no hace una elección concurrente. Una elección concurrente es una elección donde se haga al mismo tiempo, donde se haga la elección de concejales, alcaldes, gobernadores, diputados regionales y hasta diputados de la Asamblea Nacional. No descartemos eso, lo cual metería al país en una mega elección que terminaría de complicar un poco más la cosa.
Thanks for that, Gustavo. Mark, Geoff, did you have any thoughts on that? Just sort of reflect on some of the things that Gustavo said.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's important to point out that Maduro has actually been contradictory on this point. Surprise, surprise. He's said on the one hand, I think back in August, he said that he thought it would be a great idea to have the mega elección that Gustavo mentioned. And then last month he said, maybe we should separate them. I think what that tells you, obviously, is that the government is being coy and they're seeing what they can get. They're seeing who they can pick apart from the opposition. They know that at least at the base level, political actors in the opposition want to be politicians. And so the government is going to try to play their cards to do what they do best, which is divide the opposition and demoralize them ahead of the upcoming elections. So far, the opposition has been pretty clear that they don't want to talk about the next elections, given that the government just stole the presidential elections. But at some point, this is going to come to a head. And, I think we all have questions about the opposition's ability to navigate some of the potential internal differences they may have with regard to electoral participation or not.
Thanks, Geoff. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, to talk about electoral participation this time, I think is folly. I mean, unless you have a brand new CNE, or at least the new head of a CNE that won't take, calls from, Flores, and be told what the results should be. And then also you need a serious observer presence. I mean, it was great that the Carter Center was there in July, but you need a more sufficient and a group larger in size like the EU. Absent those conditions, I don't think it's meaningful to be talking about the elections. That said, look, it's ultimately going to be a decision made by the opposition. I think principally by Maria Corina. As I've noted, she's the only figure in the country with any sort of real standing. If she concludes that there's some value in participating, that you can open up some political space as a result, then I think people will come out. But right now, polling suggests people are, less enthusiastic about voting than they were early this year, needless to say. But I think it does raise a larger question with regard to post-January 10th. Now, obviously, we all hope that somehow Edmundo is inaugurated on January 10th, but if it doesn't happen, I think, you will start to hear from the opposition about, potential partial solutions that may be unsatisfactory, and, ideas that have been floated but sort of set aside for now, coalition government, some variations of elections, shortening Maduro's term. I mean, something creative. I don't know. Again, there's no indication that the regime is even open to discuss any of this. But post January 10th, there may be opportunities for discussing things that at least I personally would find highly unsatisfactory, but my view doesn't matter. All that matters is that of the Venezuelan people. And I think the kind of things they would probably reject today, but maybe in the coming months becomes more feasible. I don't know.
Thanks, Mark. There is a last question here by Victoria that I did want to throw out, and then I'll wrap up. But her question is about some of the mistakes the current administration made towards Venezuela, in its Venezuela policy. Geoff, do you want to tackle that, Mark? And of course, if you have some thoughts, and Gustavo, I mean, essentially, what could the Biden administration have done differently? Where did it make missteps? And if you don't want to go in that direction, where should it have really doubled down?
Yeah, so I think, from my perspective, I think the Biden administration deserves more credit than it's gotten for the fact that we are where we are. We wouldn't have had the election on July 28th if it weren't for the decision to put sanctions relief on the table and try to use it as an incentive to get to those elections. We wouldn't have had a primary and obviously we know the importance of that primary in ratifying Maria Corina's importance inside the opposition. We wouldn't have had any of that if the Biden administration hadn't sought to use the leverage that exists to try to play with incentives inside the regime. So I think it's important to recognize that. Having said that, I do believe that too many folks in this town, myself included, believed that it would be costlier for the government to steal the election than it ultimately ended up being. I think a lot of us believed that, that the country was a tinderbox, and that the stealing the election would inevitably result in massive unrest, and that, on the other hand, it would force Maduro to basically tell the military that, hey, all these last 2 years of sanctions relief that you've been enjoying, and how I've been telling you that I can land the plane of normalization, well, that's not happening anymore because I need to repress these protests massively. And so we all assumed that would introduce much more inherent dilemmas inside the regime than we ultimately ended up seeing. But on the other hand, I think it's easy to overstate how strong the government is right now. This is the first time that we've seen Diosdado Cabello in government since Chavez died. There's a reason why Maduro has kept him at bay. And so, there are indications that Maduro has had to make some pretty unsavory compromises to stay in power. And ultimately, that's what we want. I think any policy needs to, whether you believe in negotiations, whether you believe in piling on the pressure, to me, the risk is just sort of sitting back and waiting for the regime to collapse under its own weight. I think we need to do everything possible to try to keep this a live issue and ensure that Venezuela remains a priority.
Thanks, Mark. Anything on your end?
I think Geoff sort of gave my answer. I agree. I thought it would be harder for the regime to steal the election with seemingly little cost. I'm a believer in people power. I was in Chile in 1988 for the plebiscite, working with the Chilean opposition. I was in Nicaragua in 1990 for the election there, when Viola Chamorro defeated Daniel Ortega. Neither of those outcomes, those were difficult to achieve. In retrospect, they seem sort of easy and natural, and they weren't. Now, that said, I was also in Panama in 1989, so I've seen aborted elections before. But I guess I assumed that a 2-to-1 victory would put more pressure on the regime and people within the regime. I anticipated that there would be massive numbers of people on the street election night and the day after, and that'll be very hard to put that down. That didn't happen for whatever reason. My understanding, and I don't have full information on this, that there were some talks between both sides on election night, however brief. And again, I don't have all the details on it. I'd like to try to understand more and what that might tell us, going forward, that there was a possibility there for some moments. But again, I do agree with Geoff that I think the Biden administration does deserve a lot of credit for having at least gotten to that point, and for giving the opposition the opportunity to expose the regime's illegitimacy, both within Venezuela and throughout the world.
Thanks, Mark. And David Adams, who most of you know is a prolific journalist, posed a question to me that I'm going to try to skirt through fairly quickly and hand it back over to Dr. Gamarra. But I'll build on, Mark, something that sort of you said. I think one of the areas of the Biden administration was, did well and sort of thoughtful was, instead of completely doing away with GL 44 conceptually as it sunset, they pivoted towards sort of a focus on specific licenses, which again I think could have been leveraged and deployed far more rapidly in a far more strategic manner, and perhaps the election sort of timeline disrupted that a little bit. And so the piece that I put out there was really about reflecting on sort of a recalibration of sanctions more in a more targeted, intentional way. Targeted sanctions are excellent, allowing for specific licenses to sort of channel U.S. businesses and international oil companies into Venezuela through American enterprises is a means of recapturing some of the space on the ground, where I do think that Venezuela or the U.S. lacks any real meaningful leverage on the ground in Venezuela today, certainly to shape any outcome. And so, kind of predicated on that, David asked whether I think that's something that the Trump administration would be attractive, 2.0 administration. I think the answer is yes, and I think the answer is yes because I think Trump is going to have to sort of balance between engagement or not. And given the importance of immigration, for example, in his foreign policy, position, he's going to have to find ways to engage the regime. If there is an expectation for deportees and getting illegal detained Americans back, I think those are some of the things that Trump may have to reconcile. That said, I don't think an incoming Marco Rubio as Secretary of State is going to be very open to that. And this may be one of the most contentious parts of sort of Marco's, Senator Rubio's position as Secretary of State, is that he may conflict with a Trump wanting to engage almost immediately. And we saw this back during the Trump, 1.0 administration with Saudi Arabia and the Khashoggi killing, and where sort of Trump, stood in terms of steadfast engagement with Saudi Arabia despite that. And so I think there may be an appetite for that in an incoming Trump administration, but it will put that in conflict with a Secretary of State Rubio. And maybe that is a sort of potential scenario in which there's the running joke that not many principles last among contact in a Trump administration. So we'll see how that goes. But the second part of that question of whether or not Trump would risk losing support of sort of West Venezuela or the Venezuelan communities. I mean, look, Trump won Miami-Dade County for the first time in decades. He pulled Miami-Dade County in a very serious way. And so it could cost him some support, but perhaps it's not enough to overturn Florida and move Florida back, you know, to the Dems. And so he may not be thinking about that at this stage, although it could put pressure on sort of his support here in South Florida. Although Trump has been incredibly resilient through a wide range of things that we thought would undermine, you know, his supporters or the support he's receiving, and it just hasn't worked. So anyway, I'll end there. Mark, Geoff, Gustavo, thank you so much for some incredibly thoughtful comments. Eduardo, I'm gonna cede the floor back over to you.
Thank you very much to all of you. I think again, this was an extraordinary conversation about something that is just around the corner. I'm delighted that we were able to have Gustavo Azócar directly from Venezuela, who gave us this incredibly detailed analysis of those catastrophic scenarios that he mentioned. I sort of take as one of the key points from his discussion and from what both Geoff and Mark were saying, this sort of call to the outgoing administration and the incoming administration to better coordinate to achieve better results in terms of policy, because in the end, what we have is one bad result between 2017 and 2020, as Gustavo pointed out, and many of you, and a not so good result from 2020 to the present. But yet there is an absolute need for both of these administrations to coordinate on a whole host of issues. And I think what our speakers this afternoon have done is really brought to the forefront a very interesting discussion that really has all of us on pins and needles looking at whatever will happen on December 10th and really, pardon me, on January 10th, and what will happen on January the 20th. So thank you to all. Thank you for those of you who attended. This is the third of our webinars, and I thank all of you for those of you who were able to join us for all three. The Venezuela Working Group will continue to be in place, and we will continue to bring additional webinars like this in the near future. Thank you all.
Thank you.